Hey everyone, can you hear me? Just fine? Great, okay. 안녕하세요. Thanks for coming to my talk. Today, I'm going to be talking about content in the era of ATT restrictions and scan. So, a little bit of background about me. I began creating content at the age of 16. I drove 100 million organic impressions on my pages, and I went on to scale multiple consumer apps, and I studied math at Stanford. So the math part, a little bit more about that. I was not a marketer to begin with. I wrote a math book when I was 16, and I realized nobody really likes math books, so I needed a way to market it, and I started content to actually promote the book. So I started a math page, grew it to around 100,000 followers, and the book ended up doing pretty well. It sold tens of thousands of copies, and realized, through making content to promote the book, there's a lot of intersection between math, which was my hobby at the time, and content. And that was the story of how Newform was born. So now we scale, world-class companies and apps across the globe. We work with apps big and small, some actually in Korea. We work with Mathpresso, which I think some of you may know in the audience. So today's talk, content as targeting. First, I want to cover a little bit of history before we dive into really how content can be used to target audiences. And then after that, we'll kind of teach you how to do it. History. So in 2020, during COVID, two interesting things happened at the same time. One was the ATT restrictions that we now know today, which severely limited the amount of data that advertisers have. On the other hand, you had TikTok, was the #1 app at the time, and everybody started consuming content at an exponential pace. So the rise of short form meant a lot more data that these platforms have on you. But at the same time, advertisers had access to less. And you can actually see this in the GPU orders by Meta. So if you look at Meta, they started acquiring NVIDIA graphic processing units, not to train their AI models first, but to train Reels. And Reels was this huge project computationally, because what you realize is Instagram and Facebook started off as social networks. And everyone here maybe has a few hundred followers, maybe 2,000 followers on Instagram, but compared to the amount of data that Reels now needs to use to display millions of pieces of content, we needed a lot more GPUs, and Zuck knew what he was doing. So you notice in the rise of short-form content what we now know as passive signals. So first, a little bit more about active signals. Back in the day, if you look at Twitter, for example, the way that these platforms knew what interests you was through active signals like likes, shares, comments. But on the average user session, you may have a few likes, a few comments. I don't know about you, but I generally don't like to comment on many things. And there was a limited amount of data that these platforms had on you. But now, with passive signals, and through algorithm-friendly design, you have a lot more data that these platforms have on you, even if you don't do anything. TikTok doesn't need you to like or share a specific piece of content for them to know that you like it. All you need to do is just watch it all the way through. So with the rise of passive signals, these platforms now have thousands of data points on you with each user session, and it's why your TikTok algorithm is so good. Same thing with Reels. They built a similar powerful algorithm where from watching 10 videos, they know exactly what you're into. And this is a little bit of comparison. So old social media, limited volume of actions, and data points are not guaranteed. I mean, you may have a user session and have very little data around your consumption. But with TikTok, user data is guaranteed. With short form, you are guaranteed to have more signal on these users. So with hundreds of data points per user session, sometimes more, millions of creatives that are now allowed to be shown versus thousands before from your social network, and more consumption. Everybody spends hours on TikTok and Reels every day now. You have a lot of useful data. Now what you can do with that is two things. The old model, which is the social graph, where you'd be connected with different users based off of who you follow and who follows you, or the new model, which is the interest graph. Now, instead of comparing you to just your friends, you're compared to everyone around the world. Social graph is old platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and the interest graph is what TikTok really innovated. It doesn't matter who you follow. It doesn't matter if you don't follow anyone, for that matter. And all you need to do is just consume content, and by virtue of that, you'll start to see patterns in your content consumption which lead to better and better algorithmic decisions. And the way this works ultimately is through collaborative filtering. So it's a very simple insight, but let's say we have user, let's say this user and this user both watch these two pieces of content, and these two pieces of content are similar to this. This user doesn't need to actually do anything else but just wait, but this user already liked this piece of content, so now this is recommended to this user. So multiply that by millions of actions every day, and the algorithm is getting better even when you're not using it, because other users are doing the hard work for you. It's very easy for TikTok to tell if a specific piece of content is viral. If you watch the first 5 seconds, that's already enough for TikTok to know that it's a good piece of content. And you have this flywheel where you get deeper and deeper user interest graphs over time, which means better matching of users and content, which means a better user experience, and so on and so forth. So it's the self-fulfilling feedback loop of really great algorithm. So a little bit about why content as targeting works. First, we have to understand that ad networks are effectively financial markets. Just like a stock market has liquidity and stocks, you're trading what's essentially ad placements. Now DSPs do this a lot more obviously, but also Meta does this on a platform level. So you have $100 billion of spend on Meta every year, but with ATT you can't really target that narrowly anymore. So what you end up having is a lot of liquidity, but super high efficiency on the ad level. And that means traditional targeting is no longer as effective. Lookalikes, retargeting audiences, with all the scan restrictions, you get less and less data, and everything becomes priced in. It's like trying to beat the stock market when you try to target narrowly. Most of the time, you're not going to beat the best media buyers or the best traders. So what we're left to target with is creative. So pre-ATT was broad content, narrowly targeted, what we call old form. But post-ATT, it's now narrow content, broadly targeted, and this is what we call new form. Now, this is a little bit of a better kind of visualization of this. Before, you have a very wide net that you cast through generic, broad brand content, and the media buyers did all the work. So a lot of big agencies would go in, do the manual media buying, and what you'll see is it's not that efficient. You actually reach very few users from your target audience with all the data restrictions. This used to work, but now it doesn't. You spend a lot of money on uninterested, unideal users. With Newform, you actually cast a smaller net, you target narrowly through your content, and you reach a lot more of the right audience. So your ad spend is maximized. And the reason this is exciting is the depth of content of short form is only increasing. These platforms are only getting more and more data on your interests, and the number of actions that are passive these days is only increasing. So your content becomes self-targeting. Everybody feels like TikTok overhears their entire conversation. You feel like your For You page knows you as a person. So our fundamental thesis at Newform is that the depth of data actually outweighs the ATT limitations and the scan restrictions if used in the right way. And here's a few kind of examples I pulled about how good self-targeting content looks like. So this is Rocket Money. Oh, my bad. This is Rocket Money. They're one of the biggest app advertisers in the US. They spend millions every month on short form. And you'll notice that good self-targeting content is specific, right? So you'll see that they're not talking about some general financial well-being. They're talking, oh, watch me cut my monthly expenses in half. Stop budgeting like this. It's very actionable, very specific. And the hooks kind of viscerally catch the target audience's attention. Now, this is an example that we made. This is one of our clients, 18 Birdies, which is a golf app. Now, they had a lot of kind of newbies download their app, a lot of new people at golf. So we try to think through what would someone like that is already interested in golf. So this type of hook would only be really understood by someone who's already a golf player. And that's 18 Birdies' ultimate target audience. So you have to think about what would be relatable to my audience and craft your content in that manner. And the last pillar is authenticity. So we had a funny example where one client actually targeted 25 plus in their campaigns. But all the users they got were teenagers, like 13-year-olds. But we looked at their content and it was all like trendy, gimmicky content. It would only really appeal to like teenagers. And the problem is like you really can't force content to certain audiences. What they ended up having is just 13-year-olds that lied about being 30, right? And you want to think about content first before targeting. Your content should naturally weed out people that are not in your target demographic. This works the opposite way too. So with 18 Birdies, you'll see that most of the audience that is targeted is actually above the age of 35. Now, we set the targeting to just 18 plus, right? But naturally, even though TikTok and all these algorithms have this section to be really large, older audiences just naturally found it more interesting. And these algorithms are optimizing for installs, for cost per trial, and they're naturally going to attract the right audience if you feed it the right content. So why it works, simply put, it's a flywheel, right? So we'll look at your product, we'll see what features your users are using, we'll make content based on that. Now the content also informs the product, because if you see a specific piece of content attract really good CPIs, really good cost per trial, now you know to emphasize that in your product, and then you have this feedback loop that goes on and on with iteration. Now, a little bit on how to do it. There's 3 pillars that I want to touch on. First is volume. What you'll notice in the new age of marketing is there's a very extreme Pareto principle. 1 in 30 ads drives half the total ad spend. And this is based on our analysis of like dozens of clients across about $100 million of ad spend. So, and this only gets more extreme as you scale. If you go back to the Rocket Money example where they spend millions of dollars on ads, you'll notice the top 5% of their ads drive the vast majority of their results. So if you have this extreme inequality, the point isn't to try to guess what works the best, because it's really hard to do that. The point is you need to understand that, hey, Newform means your top ads are going to be really good, the average ad is going to be really bad. And that means you need volume. You need to be experimenting, but you don't just throw things at the wall. You need to be more structured in your experimentation. So instead of just hiring random creators or like testing random concepts, you should have hypotheses around what content works the best. You should think deeply through what hooks work the best. How do you actually attract the right audience to the right concept? And this is a little bit of a visualization. This is kind of how we do it. But it all starts with engaging content. So the hook is obviously very important, but a lot of people forget that your call to action is also important. Your click-through rate, all that, to actually eventually find this top winner. You need to go through a lot of testing to reach it. And it's not just enough to vary the hook. It's not just enough to vary the body. The way we do it is actually varying both at the same time, so you map out the entire landscape of content. So instead of what a lot of kind of app advertisers do is go back. they'll like look at a specific concept and they'll just try 10 different hooks, right? But they don't vary the concept. Or the opposite, well, they'll try unique concepts, right? What we call the body of the video, but not really experiment with the hook. And the reality is you need to do both to really map out everything. So you'll see like you kind of map out the whole kind of mountain of content if you test both the hook and the body versus kind of like your usual approach would be to just take random shots on target, which means your learnings are unstructured. You actually don't know if the incremental batch of content or the incremental piece of content is going to help you reach your efficacy goals because you're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall. And we see this all the time where you have great creative ideas, but you lack the structure to actually build upon it. Which brings me to my next point, which is creative learning retention. So most of the time, app advertisers will just go through and churn through dozens of influencers. What you're going to realize is the creator themselves is the biggest independent variable. So you don't know when experimenting with different creators if it's the creator that's working or not working, or the actual creative, the concept or the hook. So we recommend, hey, test a lot of creators at first, find one that works for you, and hire them. This, was what I did when I was at my first app. I literally made the content, I ran the campaigns, and you want to keep your learnings retained within your team instead of trying out a bunch of stuff and not really building on top of your learnings. So my biggest piece of advice is you want to be able to document your creative learning. So keep a Google Doc, keep a spreadsheet of what you learn because you can actually compound. And that's how you ultimately reach scale. So to recap, where we are post-ATT. Traditional targeting is just simply not as effective. You have low match rates, when you upload audiences, Scan made everything a lot harder. And these days, we have passive signals that are dominant over active signals. So algorithms don't really need to have install data to really find, for example, the best winner. It's already knows what the top 10% of ads are, literally just by looking at view-through rates and hook rates. And TikTok unlocked this whole interest graph that means more and more content data that you can use as an advertiser to promote your app through good content. And ultimately, you're not beating the algorithm. That's one thing that we say to a lot of people is like, you're not beating the algorithm at scale. You're just buy kind of an index fund, which is what we call just going broad. Similar to the stock market, you're not beating the stock market by trying to play little arbitrage games. And the depth of content ultimately means you don't need to play those games, right? The number of actions that you have today means that you can actually get back to pre-ATT, pre-2020 levels of performance through content. And yeah, so to recap, volume, focus, and creative learning retention. And our fundamental thesis is paid acquisition is as effective as ever. The way to do it right has just changed. So I think that's it for my talk. Thanks for coming. This is my LinkedIn if you want to connect with me. But yeah, this is a great turnout. Thank you so much, and 감사합니다.